grandmother found an old suitcase of her late husband. She was surprised when she opened it. Jane's grandparents lived in perfect harmony for nearly 63 years. Grace and Frank had known each other since early childhood, and when they turned 18 they got married because Grace got pregnant. About 10 years ago, Frank Nelson passed away, leaving the inconsolable widow of their house where they raised 2 children and lived a long life together. After her husband's demise, Mrs. Nelson refused to sell the house and move in with her grandchildren, who promised her a quiet life surrounded by care and comfort. Unfortunately, it turned out that Grace was rather old school, and despite being lonely she still chose the comfort of her own home over a change of scenery. To help Mrs. Nelson with the housekeeping, her 3 grandchildren took turns coming over, and the beautiful Jane stood out among them. It was a beautiful summer day when she decided to visit her grandmother. Seeing Jane in front of the house, Mrs. Nelson was very happy about the visit of her beloved granddaughter. Deep down the old woman knew that she loved Jane a bit more than the rest of her grandchildren. It was probably because Jane was very hardworking and had no equal in housekeeping. Looking at her grandmother, Mrs. Nelson remembered when she was young and quietly brushed away her tears. Having given her grandmother a long hug, Jane quickly tidied up the house and washed the floors. Then bustling about in the kitchen, she occasionally exchanged a few words with Mrs. Nelson, who was in the living room. Thanks to the working air conditioner it wasn't so hot there. At first, the conversation was lively, but about half an hour later the old woman fell silent and Jane heard quiet sobs coming from the living room. Having heard this, Jane went to check on her grandmother without even taking her apron off. She opened the door quietly so as not to startle her grandmother. Jane was surprised to see the old woman holding a picture of her deceased husband and crying over it. Still oblivious to her granddaughter's presence, Mrs. Nelson whispered softly, "Frankie darling, why did you have to go and leave me here all alone? We've lived in perfect harmony for so many years and now I'm on my own. I'm sick and I don't have enough money. I'm not complaining, but Frankie, I can't leave the house as if something's holding me within these walls. But I don't have enough energy to maintain it. I only pray for one thing, for you to take me to wherever it is you are as soon as possible, and if you don't want me there with you then at least give me a sign, tell me what to do." Hearing her grandmother, Jane's heart broke and tears welled up in her eyes. However, she pulled herself together and went into the living room pretending that she hadn't heard anything. "Grandma dear, what's the matter? Are you feeling bad?" the granddaughter asked, carefully stroking the woman on her hunched slender back. "No love, I'm okay. I was just thinking about Frank and it made me sad," Mrs. Nelson answered uncertainly, trying to make her words sound believable, but Jane was a smart girl and it wasn't that easy to trick her. So the next day, the loving granddaughter called her relatives and explained the situation, which clearly proved that Mrs. Nelson could no longer live alone. Since Jane was the only one of all the grandchildren who could work remotely, she talked to her manager and he agreed to let her work from home most of the time, only coming to the office twice a week to report on what she'd done. Happy about this wonderful solution to their problem, Jane moved into Mrs. Nelson's house a couple of days later. "Well Grandma, now we're going to live together so you won't feel sad or lonely anymore," said the girl, happily hugging the fragile old woman. Mrs. Nelson couldn't believe what was happening and burst into tears of joy, thanking the Lord for his help. The day when Jane moved in with her grandmother was very emotional for both women. They were incredibly happy to be living together. Mrs. Nelson simply couldn't stop smiling, which made Jane's heart sing. Then in the evening, as the 2 women were drinking tea in the kitchen, Jane plucked up her courage and asked her grandmother about what she overheard her saying in the living room a couple of days ago. Mrs. Nelson's face immediately darkened and her forehead got covered in wrinkles. But then, sighing sadly, the woman gathered her strength and said, "You know Jane, of course you know your grandfather and I got married at 18 and we lived a long life side by side. But despite having shared a long life I still feel like I didn't know him at all. Even though Frank brought home a lot of money every week, he never gave it to me. He probably either hid it somewhere or spent it. And throughout his entire life Frank never once mentioned his work. He obviously had many secrets from me and maybe even another woman. Jane, who was listening attentively to the old woman, suddenly blushed and looked away. She had always considered the family of her grandparents to be exemplary, and therefore she didn't want to hear that it might not have been perfect after all. Meanwhile, Mrs. Nelson took a sip of her tea and continued, "You see, dear, Frank has been deceased for 10 years, but I still don't know anything about his work. Moreover, I don't even know the names of his friends or colleagues. The only thing I do know for sure is that Frank spent a lot of time in the garage where his things are now stored. Sometimes I think about going there, but I stop myself every time, afraid of what kind of truth I might find there. Grandma, do you want to go through grandfather's things together? I think it's better to find out the truth once and for all. Instead of letting your imagination run wild, thinking up awful scenarios," Jane said excitedly, taking the old woman by the hand. However, to Jane's surprise, Mrs. Nelson was adamant in her refusal to go through her deceased husband's things. Her words sounded remarkably confident and sharp. Unsure about what to say, Jane shrugged. The young woman clearly realized that the family life of her grandparents wasn't as good as she used to think. These thoughts didn't leave Jane's head for the rest of the night, and when she was about to go to bed, Mrs. Nelson came into her bedroom. The old woman was struggling to find the right words, but she asked her granddaughter to forgive her for the rather unpleasant conversation they had and offered to go to the garage and see what Frank had stored there. Despite the fact that it was already dark outside, Jane was happy to accept her grandmother's proposal. Having had some difficulty opening the rusty lock on the gate, the women finally got inside. The first thing that Jane noticed was the table with many of her grandfather's tools covered in dust and cobwebs, and the stuffy air of the room that hadn't been aired in a long time. Having exchanged glances with Mrs. Nelson, the girl sighed in disappointment and was about to go back into the house when suddenly she saw a massive metal cabinet standing in the corner. The door was tightly closed. If Mrs. Nelson decided not to keep a bunch of keys that belonged to her late husband, they might have never been able to open it. Inside this secure, fireproof cabinet were piles of neatly tied folders with documents. Looking closer, Jane saw an old battered suitcase at the very bottom of this makeshift safe. Mrs. Nelson didn't care about the documents, but the contents of the suitcase seemed to have aroused genuine interest in the old woman. Wanting to satisfy her grandmother's curiosity, Jane brought the suitcase into the house so they could study its contents in a cozy atmosphere. In addition to the office supplies, the suitcase had a bunch of old letters, written by Frank Nelson to his wife, which he never sent out for some reason. In those letters, Frank wrote how much he loved his wife and how sorry he was that he couldn't spend more time with her and their family. In fact, Frank Nelson's letters had something that the man couldn't tell his wife during all those years together. But the most frightening and revealing was the last letter, in which Mr. Nelson told the truth about his work. Written in small handwriting, the letter read, "Dear Grace, please forgive me for everything I've been hiding the truth for you for many years, because I've been working for the CIA. Of course there's no way you could have known, but many years ago, I was made head of a secret department which was in direct contact with the country's top management. Since I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement and all the information I was dealing with was classified, I was doomed to live my life in deception, pretending to be someone else. Grace, I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me for these forced lies, because that's not even the main part. I got paid well for special operations, but since I couldn't explain to you where the large amounts of money were coming from, I hid it and then used it to buy jewelry for you. The suitcase you're holding now has a secret bottom. Cut through the lining and you will find the jewelry in it. But don't get too excited yet, because this is just a small part of what I've saved up. You'll find the second hiding place in the wall by the door behind the painting hanging on it. There's a secret door there behind a layer of plaster. The key is at the bottom of this suitcase. I believe that the proceeds from the sale of this jewelry will make you happy, especially after so many years of my deception. Now you know everything. Forgive me and please don't be angry. Love you, your Frank." After reading the letter, Jane and Mrs. Nelson started crying without saying a word. When the grandmother and granddaughter came to their senses, they followed the instructions of Frank Nelson, who turned out to be a CIA agent. At the bottom of the suitcase, the women found 12 items of jewelry that must have cost a fortune. But the biggest surprise was waiting for them in the safe hidden in the wall. It was filled to the brim with gold bars that instantly turned Mrs. Nelson into a millionaire. After what she found in the garage, Jane's grandmother felt like a mountain fell off her shoulders. Grace Nelson finally decided to sell the house and move in with her granddaughter, with whom she'd shared part of the fortune left by her grandfather Frank. The old woman often cries at night, remembering the years when she was happy in her ignorance and didn't even suspect who her husband really was, who managed to provide for her even after his demise. Every time she looks at her late husband's photograph, Mrs. Nelson asks Frank to forgive her for suspecting that he had an affair, instead of simply trusting the love of her life. But the most important thing for the old woman was that deep down in her soul, she still loved her deceased husband, and she was happy to learn that the years they lived together meant as much to him as they did to her.